We're having a bit of a technical delay. We'll be right with you.
Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming out. This time I'd just like to introduce our moderator for the evening. Our moderator for tonight is Mr. Gerald McCaffrey. Gerald is a school connection specialist for Christ the Redeemer Catholic Schools in Brooks and presently assigned to Holy Family Academy. He works with staff and students from kindergarten to grade 4 using restorative justice practices to connect students through recess programs, friendship skills training in classrooms, and emotional regulation programs. Gerald is also a professional speaker, magician, and master of ceremony for weddings, public, private, businesses, church, and political events. He's been entertaining hearts and minds for over 20 years and has spoken at events across Canada. Please welcome with me our moderator, Mr. Gerald McCaffrey.
Thank you very much. Good evening and welcome to the ATA Political Forum for the Brooks Medicine Hat MLA by-election. My name is Gerald McCaffrey and it's my pleasure to be your moderator. On behalf of the ATA, we are glad that all of you have been able to make it here this evening, especially considering it's starting to snow. I also want to welcome those who are online through streaming. Participation in political events like this is one of the key cornerstones to a democratic society. Thank you to the ATA locals, Grasslands, and Christ the Redeemer for hosting tonight. And thank you to Griffin Park Theatre for lending us their space. And thank you, of course, to all of our candidates. Some general housekeeping items before we begin. I ask that you please turn off your cell phone ringers. Should you need to take a call, we ask that you leave the theatre to do so. And if you need a washroom, it's out towards your left, my right, and then right down the hallways, both the men's and the women's down there. If we have a need to use a fire exit, there's 2 fire exits at the back, there's one over there, and of course out the front, and just head out across the street. I'm going to go over the rules for this evening. Tonight is more of a forum than a debate. Candidates will be invited to answer questions, and though differing opinions will come up, discussion rather than a debate style is the purpose of tonight's event. Here's how this evening is going to play out. First, we will have our national anthem and have the land acknowledgement read, and then I will provide an introduction for each of our candidates. We will then move on to different types of questions. For each question, each candidate will have 2 minutes each to respond. There will be no opening remarks. I will begin with 5 general questions that each of the candidates has been provided with ahead of time. Next, I will ask stakeholder questions, which have not been provided to the candidates ahead of time, and those will include questions from people like principals and EAs and things like that. There will be 4 of those. This will then be followed up by audience-based questions for specific candidates, and all of them will get an opportunity to answer them as well. Audience that would like to ask a question, we have cue cards down here. You can grab one from there or out front where you entered, and hand them in over here to Braden and Brent, and they will go through them to make sure that they are on topic with provincial politics and they're not repeat questions, etc. For those watching at Grasslands ATA online, you can text your questions to Brent if you have any, and for those who are with the Christ the Redeemer, you can text or email them to Christian Shell. The last question will be asked at 8:30 p.m., and at 8:45 p.m., candidates will have 2 minutes to have closing arguments or comments. We will finish off at 9 p.m. sharp. However, the doors will remain open till 9:30, giving you 30 minutes to engage with the candidates in person if you wish, and if they are able to. Considering the snowstorm, I'm not sure of what they need to do. To ensure timeliness, we have a timer's roll. Tonight, our timer is Mr. Christian Shell. Christian will indicate how much time each candidate has left. So candidates, if you can look at the paddles, the green one will indicate you have 1 minute left. The yellow one will indicate you have 30 seconds left. The red one will indicate that you have 10 seconds left, and then I will interrupt you at 2 minutes exactly. No candidate will be allowed over 2 minutes. As the moderator of tonight's event, I have the final say in all matters. I would now like to call upon Leslie Jensen with the Brooks Composite High School to lead us in our national anthem, and I invite you all to stand.
O Canada, our home and native land, true patriot love in all of us command, car t'embrasser porte le pays, il se porte la croix. Ton histoire est une épopée des plus brillants exploits. God keep our land glorious and free. O Canada, we stand on guard for thee. O Canada, we stand on guard for thee.
Thank you, Leslie. That was amazing. And you threw in some French. Next, I would like to ask Jason Schilling up to read our land acknowledgement.
Good evening, and thank you everybody for being here this evening, and thank you to the candidates as well. The Alberta Teachers Association acknowledges Treaty 7 territory, the ancestral and traditional territory of the Blackfoot Confederacy, Kainai, Piikani, Siksika, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and Stoney Nakoda First Nation. We acknowledge the many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples whose footsteps have marked these lands for generations. We are grateful for the traditional knowledge keepers and elders who are still with us today and those who have gone before us. We recognize the land as an act of reconciliation and gratitude to those whose territory we reside on or are visiting. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jason. Before I introduce our candidates, I have a word on civility. Politics is not for the faint of heart. Passions rise, feelings are inflamed, and people want to be heard. These candidates are people who are here to serve. They may not hold to your politics, they may not be your type of person, but they are willing to do a great service. They deserve the respect and restraint that all of us would want. Let's get started now with our candidate introductions. Candidates, as I introduce you, I ask you to just stand and give a wave. Our candidates are seated alphabetically on your left to right, alphabetically. Members of the audience, I do ask that you please hold your applause until after I finish the last candidate. First up is Bob Blayon, Independence Party of Alberta. Bob Blayon is an Alberta advocate who believes in freedom and prosperity for all, and is a man who puts the well-being and success of all Albertans first. He is a proud Métis with ancestral ties that date back to his fourth grandfather, Chief Black Powder, the last holdout of the signing of Treaty 6, a man who opposed the global elites of his time. Mr. Blayon is a co-founder and former president of the Alberta Prosperity Project. He chose to move on from the educational organization of APP to what he realized was the best grassroots political vehicle of the day, the Independence Party of Alberta. Mr. Blayon has always stood for truth, honesty, integrity, and accountability, and is known by his friends as a protector of the people, fearless when it comes to doing the right thing or calling out others to do the right thing. He is a father of 2 adult children and has been married to his wife, Dana, for 31 years. Bob Blayon. Next up, we have Gwendolyn Dirk, New Democrat Party. Gwendolyn Dirk learned the values of family, hard work, empathy, and integrity while growing up on her family's farm. As an English teacher for 33 years, Ms. Dirk understands the dedication needed to help others collaborate and the importance of building community. Ms. Dirk volunteers her time with Samus Immigration, helping newcomers learn English, and has joined the Medicine Hat Police Commission as a commissioner. Ms. Dirk believes Albertans deserve strong public health care and public education, and she is running to stand up for small business owners, farmers, ranchers, and all rural Albertans. Ms. Dirk, New Democratic Party. Next up, we have Jeevan Singh Mangat, Independence Party of Alberta. Jeevan Singh Mangat immigrated to Calgary with his family from Kenya in 1970, where he attended junior and senior high school in Calgary and graduated from the University of Calgary with a degree in civil engineering. Mr. Mangat has experience as a small business operator and has volunteered in the past for Kids Cancer Foundation, Children's Wish Foundation, the Third Academy School for Special Needs Children, and the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. For the last 16 years, Mr. Mangat has been employed as a commercial property manager and achieved his certification of property management, or CPM. As a member of the Wild Rose Independent Party of Alberta since 2020, Jeevan has volunteered on the Leadership Selection Committee and for the Provincial Nomination Committee. He has attended Wild Rose events in the past year in Red Deer and Last Chance Saloon near Drumheller. He has also conducted presentations for Wild Rose CAs regarding duties of the local constituency nomination committee and conducting nominee search. Mr. Mangat and his wife Nina have been married for 39 years and have 2 adult children. Mr. Mangat, Independence Party of Alberta. Next up, Barry Morishita, Alberta Party. Barry Morishita was born and raised in Alberta and has spent almost his entire life in the Brooks area. He has been a member of Brooks City Council for 16 years, including 5 as our mayor. He also served for 7 years on the Alberta Municipalities Board, including 4 as president. Mr. Morishita operated a small business in Brooks for 30 years and has always been a community builder. Mr. Morishita is married to his wife, Jean, and has 2 daughters, a son-in-law, and 2 grandchildren. Mr. Morishita, Alberta Party. And lastly, the Honourable Danielle Smith, Premier of Alberta, Conservative Party. Danielle Smith is a proud Albertan. She is a University of Calgary graduate with degrees in economics and English. Ms. Smith has had a lifelong interest in Alberta public policy and finding the right balance between free enterprise and individual freedom, and the role of government. She was a member of the Legislative Assembly for Highwood and leader of the official opposition. Before re-entering politics, Ms. Smith had extensive experience in the media and in business. Most recently, she was president of the Alberta Enterprise Group. Before that, she was a radio host with Chorus Entertainment for 6 years. She married her husband, David, in 2006, and together they own and operate the Dining Car, a fully renovated 1940s railcar dining car. She is the proud stepmother of David's son, Jonathan. Ms. Smith and David live in High River. Danielle Smith, Conservative Party. Oh, and sorry, she's got 2 dogs, Kane and Colt. And of course, she was sworn in as our Premier of Alberta on October 11th, 2022. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a round of applause for our candidates this evening. Welcome, candidates. We will now begin with our 5 general questions, and we will go in alphabetical order. So that means, Mr. Blayon, we are going to begin with you. I will ask the question, and then you can go ahead and answer, and then I will ask it again for each one of you. Mr. Blayon, what do you see is the biggest problem facing public education today, and what would you do to help resolve it? What is the biggest problem facing public education today? What would you do to help resolve it? Mr. Blayon.
Thank you. Well, everywhere I travel, I hear the same thing. The outreach I get is funding. I'll cut right to the chase. I hear stories of teachers being out of pocket for classroom expenses, lack of resources, too large classrooms, and now inflation is complicating matters. So at the end of the day, you need more funding, and you're not alone. Everyone is asking, but where is that money going to come from? That's the billion-dollar question. Through COVID, I'll make a statement that this overreaction to that has bankrupted us, has further complicated the issue, and the bottom line is we're in trouble economically. We all know it. Nobody's alone. I'm heartbroken to hear the stories from the most at risk, the most impoverished right now. So it's a very complicated situation, one that we've never seen before, and I don't know what's going to get us out of this, but we all need to work together to find solutions. That's the only solution of the day, is working together. And this is why I'm here today, is learning, hearing other ideas, and working together as Albertans can do. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Blayon. I did forget to mention once again to the candidates, there are cards that will go up. The green will tell you have 1 minute left, the yellow will tell you have 30 seconds, and red will tell you have 10 seconds. Mr. Blayon, you were more than well within your time. Next up, Ms. Dirk. Ms. Dirk, what is the biggest problem facing public education today? What would you do to help resolve it? What is the biggest problem facing public education today? What would you do to help resolve it, Ms. Dirk?
Thank you for that question. Education and public education is something that is so close to my heart. I spent 33 years teaching in public education. 20 of those years was right in the public school system, and 13 years was at the college where I taught in upgrading adult development, teaching adults coming back for a second chance. So I love this type of question. Quite simply, the problem with public education in Alberta at this particular point is the UCP. The UCP has demonstrated to us in the last 3 years that they don't care about public education. Well, how do I know that? Well, let's take, for example, in the last 2 years, education has actually been underfunded. In the last 2 years, $600 million and $400 million, respectively, has not been spent in the education budget. No new schools have been built, and things like cruelly cutting PUF funding in education is a clear indication that the UCP has demonstrated they do not value public education. In addition to that, 1,000 fewer teachers are in the classroom now, even though we have more students. I know that with the NDP, we will fund public education. We will support teachers in the classroom. We will put money back into PUF funding. We will put money back into reducing class sizes. We will hire TAs back, many of who were fired during the pandemic, and we will generally support public education.
Thank you very much, Ms. Dirk. Mr. Mangat, same question. What is the biggest problem facing public education today, and what would you do to help resolve it? What is the biggest problem facing public education today, and what would you do to help resolve it? Mr. Mangat.
Thank you for that question.
Yeah, I don't think his mic's working because I don't think we tested it when... Can you just give me yours, Barry, for now? And we'll get that working for you.
Test.
Oh, now it's
There we
working.
go.
There we go.
Okay.
Sorry about that. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you for the question. Sitting in the middle, I can get quite nervous. I'll take another viewpoint of funding public education, which is seldom considered. Because I have a strong background in commercial property management, I look at buildings. And one of the factors we forget about public education is our infrastructure. So our school infrastructure is getting very old, and we need to develop capital plans to address some of these issues. So that means if the roofing is failing, the boilers, the floors, all of that infrastructure costs a lot of money. Now, as a member of the Wild Rose Independent Party, we wish to also keep taxes lower. So how do we address this? We cannot address this mammoth problem in like 1 year. It has to be a slow process of improving our infrastructure, and it'll take us a number of years. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mangat. Mr. Marashida, what is the biggest problem facing public education today, and what would you do to help resolve it? What is the biggest problem facing education today, and what would you do to help resolve it? Mr. Marashida.
First of all, thank you for the opportunity, and thank you all for attending. I think this is an important forum. So I really believe it comes down to not listening. I think for 10 years or more, teachers and administrators, people that work in the public system, haven't been heard. You know, when we look at the things that we're struggling against, class size, we've had the recommendation, but no one has acted, no one has listened. We've wanted wellness supports. I talk to teachers every day in the last 25 that have asked for wellness supports, don't receive them. Teachers weren't involved in their pension, how and when it was managed, what was happening there. In the curriculum development, where was the stamp of approval from teachers? When it comes to ESL here in Brooks, where are the supports that teachers and schools have been asking for? So I think what it comes down to really is that the government has not been paying attention to teachers themselves. We need to trust professionals to do their job, and we need to seek out their wisdom and their advice when it comes to classroom management. Why do we have 30+ kids in school? Why don't we have enough ESL supports in Brooks? Why do we have kids struggling, mental health-wise and otherwise? Because we haven't been listening. And I think my job as an MLA is to be that conduit to listen and to make sure your issues are heard. And I think, in fact, that is the biggest problem right now. If we took good advice, we would be in a much better place educationally in this province.
Thank you very much, Mr. Morishida. And lastly, Ms. Smith, what is the biggest problem facing public education today? What would you do to help resolve it? What is the biggest problem facing public education today? What would you do to help resolve it? Ms. Smith.
Well, good evening, and to all of you here, and also to all the teachers who are watching here tonight as we have these discussions. I'm Danielle Smith, and before I say anything more, I just want you to know that I am a friend of Alberta teachers and to our education system. I appreciate being invited here this evening. And I know that being an educator, it's not just a job, it's a calling. And so I appreciate the work that you do, because it's a lifelong commitment to the next generation to help them prepare for the road ahead. And I truly thank you for the work that you do. I think it's no secret that we've had a bit of a bumpy relationship with our government and the teachers over the last few years. It may be one of the reasons why we ended up with a new leadership contest and why we have new leadership. But I think that what we must begin with is a position of mutual respect. And we've got to restore that between government and the teachers. We are partners, we're not adversaries. When I look at the most urgent issues, I look at it as kind of a pre-COVID issue and a post-COVID issue, because new issues emerged during the last 2.5 years. Pre-COVID, I think our biggest concern was not having the extra support in the classroom, particularly education assistance. I've heard when you have a large complex classroom with kids with multiple learning needs, just having those extra hands in the classroom is going to be very important to making sure that the teacher is able to focus on the learning needs of all children. So that's one area that we need to shore up. But it became especially acute, I think, in the last 2.5 years as we began to see, with the disruption in schooling, online learning, my greatest concern is the learning loss that we've seen with kids over the last 2.5 years. How we're going to test to identify that. I understand some of the testing requirements are a bit onerous, so we can work on that. But the main thing is we've got to get kids up to the reading level so that they can be prepared for the future. Sorry, I had a little bit more time left, but I see that I'm out of time, so I'll save it for the next one. Thanks very much for coming out tonight.
Thank you, Ms. Smith. And thank you all for answering our first question. For our second question, we are going to go in reverse alphabetical order. That means, Ms. Smith, we are going to begin this next question with you. I also realize that you all have these questions in front of you, so I'm going to only read them once this time. Here's the second question, starting with you, Ms. Smith. Over the last decade, classroom supports have not kept up with the diverse and growing needs of students. Large and growing class sizes and inclusion of students with special learning needs pose a real day-to-day challenge for teachers. How will you support students in large and complex classrooms, Ms. Smith?
I think one of the main things that we need to do, especially for the kids who have really acute needs, we have to demonstrate the support for inclusion by ensuring that the kids do have those supports. My former sister-in-law was an education assistant because her little one that she was taking care of had very severe medical needs. And I remember hearing her stories about how difficult it was that she was the only one in the classroom to help with all the other kids who had needs. So I think we've got to prioritize, and I've talked to the folks in the disabilities community, and there's additional problems across the board as we get into adulthood as well. But if we begin with the basis of identifying what the learning and particular medical challenges are for a child, if they require around-the-clock care, then we have to make sure that we have dedicated education assistance for those very high needs learners. And then we need to have additional supports of education assistance to help with the additional learning needs we're going to have as we make sure that kids are reading at grade level and doing math at grade level. And then we have to have a common understanding about what is a manageable class size for our teachers. I think that when I was growing up, it was 30 kids in a classroom was sort of typical. I understand many classes are much higher than that. When you have younger grades, you need to have smaller class sizes. I think that we have talked about average class size, but I don't know that we've met some of the targets that came out of the learning report from years ago. So those would be what I would like to do, is let's come to a common understanding of what the class size ought to be. Let's make sure that we're having education assistance in the classroom for the most severe learning needs, and then have additional hands on deck so that we can help address some of the issues as we're addressing the shortfalls in learning that have occurred over the last couple of years.
Thank you very much, Ms. Smith. Mr. Morishita, how will you support students in large and complex classrooms?
All right, well, I think first of all we do have to talk about funding. Funding is an issue, but there's also the ever-changing environment that teachers are teaching in. So, you know, we all get a base funding. I just was aware of a situation right here in Brooks where, you know, we passed this arbitrary deadline of September 30th. School boards are getting their money. You get 5 or 6 new ESL students with no resources whatsoever to support those. Like, how do we expect to have the same output when we're not putting the proper inputs into the classroom? And our system is inflexible. We as people are not inflexible. We adjust to weather, we adjust to our jobs, we adjust to our pay, we adjust to emergencies in our own lives, yet we expect teachers in the classroom to manage on exactly what they were given at the very beginning of the year, no matter what happens throughout the year. That's not right. Our job as a province and our job as a Department of Education, I would think, is to provide that output at grade 12 where children have as much opportunity as the child beside them. When we are denying those inputs, that is going to be a problem. So we talk about having some sort of a flexible way to deal with these changes. Mental health issues, wellness issues, English as a second language, medical issues that can happen after September 30th. These are people we're dealing with, and we have to remember that's what the system should be built for. So I think there's got to be a way to trust administrators and trust teachers, establish a base, and then go on from there to say, hey, we need funding so that we can make good decisions about putting those inputs into the classroom. So that does mean more EAs. That does mean more, perhaps, tech. I don't know exactly all of the things. Trust people to do that job. But again, it has to be flexible. We're dealing with people. If we're adding new initiatives, new curriculum, resources have to come with that. You can't expect teachers, anybody, to do more job with less resource. So I think we have to be very important about that.
Thank you very much, Mr. Morishita.
Thanks.
Mr. Mangate, same question. How will you support students in large and complex classrooms?
Yes, so I will speak inclusion of students with special learning needs. Volunteering for the 3rd Academy School at the board level, a school dedicated to children with special needs and children that had major disabilities. Comparing that to the public school system. Students that came from the public school systems just simply could not manage these kids with special needs. They need to be in a classroom size of about 7 kids. They need to have very focused teachers in the classroom, and the 3rd Academy was very successful in finding these teachers who are so passionate about working with children with disabilities, and I often have conversations with teachers about this. And the public school, where the classroom size is just so big, the teachers cannot manage children with special needs as well as children that are in the mainstream. So as member of Wild Rose Independence, we favor the funding following the student, so parents with special needs children can afford to have their children in these types of school and receive good education. Mr. Moderator.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mangat. Ms. Dirk, how will you support students in large and complex classrooms?
Thank you. That is a very good question. Well, having taught in the system, I understand what it is like to have classes filled with special needs students. And I can tell you that one of the most valuable resources to have in the classroom with you are the educational assistants. They are extremely important because it allows for the teacher to spend one-on-one time with each of the students. The more time you have to develop relationships with students and get to know the students, especially students with high needs and special needs, the more you can move them towards success in the classroom. This is something that's very important to me and very close to my heart. When you cut something like PUF funding, this actually puts young children between 2.5 years old and 6 years old far behind. It takes them years to catch up, and so this is something that I know that the NDP has indicated they are committed to restoring. The other thing that you need is you need to have smaller classes. And that way, smaller classes with EAs in the class. When you fire 20,000 EAs in the middle of a pandemic when they're most required in the classroom, that hurts education. That hurts teachers and that hurts students. And so we would restore some of that. We would restore funding to PUF funding. We would restore funding to education. And basically, in the end, we would fund schooling properly so that systems could be in place to help students.
Thank you very much, Ms. Dirk. Mr. Blayon?
Well,
How will you support students in large and complex classrooms?
Well, I'm going to sound like a broken record all evening. I don't disagree. More teachers and teachers' assistants are needed, but again, where's that funding going to come from? Tax increases or taking on more debt is unsustainable. We have far surpassed the point of being broke. Many Albertans are having trouble making ends meet, and businesses also. A lot of businesses are struggling, and that is our tax base. As a successful business owner of over 25 years, my focus is always on revenue and expenditures. I'm a realist, so where does the funding going to come from? Here's a sobering conversation I had with a head of a public union. This individual stated to me, "We are on the verge of losing everything. Our jobs, our pensions, everything. To recover quickly, to support one another, Alberta's resource potential must be fully unleashed again. And for that, we must come together and support the resurgence of Alberta's economic prosperity through resource development. Today, we are policy locked. Alberta needs to defend our sovereign rights and freedoms to produce our resources, to get our economic engine fired up again, and solve these problems. Everybody needs the same thing. We need to get there, so thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you all of you for answering our
students start to change with the times. And so that's something that's very important. I think one of the things that's very important is that you don't cut funding to education the way it has been cut in the last 3 years. In the last 2 years alone, I mentioned earlier, there has been $1 billion of underfunding in education, and there have been 20,000 EAs lost. And I know I'm sounding like a broken record here, but I'm going to go back to how would we fund education? We would respect public education. We would fund public education. We put the money back into the classrooms where they need it. How would we get that money? Well, I think for starters, we would cancel the war room and we would fund the classroom. So that is basically how we would do it. We would respect teachers and we would fund public education properly.
Thank you very much. And I lost my place 1 second here. And so on to you, Mr. Mangat. How would you go about restoring education funding so that it's in line with inflation and takes into account the increased complexities of the student population?
Yes. So the definition of inflation is inflating the money supply. When governments keep printing money, that's just how you get inflation all the time. Inflation doesn't mean increase of price, that's price inflation. But to address the question of the complexity, the complex of the student population, one solution would be we start refocusing on the basics, on the fundamentals, ensure our students are strong in math, English, biology, chemistry. Those are the fundamentals they need when they graduate. We can throw as much money as possible to these types of institutions. Sometimes money is not the answer. You need to at least have a conversation with the inner workings of the school system, and find out where the real problem is. Education is complex, but we need to return to the fundamentals where we are not strong.
Thank you very much. Mr. Morishita, how would you go about restoring education funding so that is in line with inflation and takes into account the increased complexity of the student population?
So I touched on it already, but I think we have to look at a new formula that has to be dynamic with the population that's in the classroom. I think it's so essential to establish a good base. You know, if we could gather all the students up in one place and everybody was equal, we have a base. But you know, just in this riding alone between Brooks and Medicine Hat, there are differences in the way education needs to be taught in Medicine Hat versus Brooks, in a small rural school versus a bigger inner city school. There are practical differences that need resources applied in a different way. We need to trust professionals to do that. But the system has to be flexible enough to do it. So I would propose that we do have some base funding, and that it is dynamic base funding, that if you get an influx of students, which I've seen as mayor in Brooks when we've had 25 Colombian families move in halfway through the year in December. No one speaks English. They're only speaking Spanish. And how do we handle that? There's no new resources. We have to be practical about this and again, trust people to do that. We should be talking about that baseline for class sizes. That study's been out there for 20-some years. K to 3, 17, 4 to 6, 23, 7 to 9, 25, 10 to 12, 27 students. We shouldn't be beyond that. That's if everything is equal. And again, I think we have to be responding quickly to the actual conditions in the classroom in order to get a good result. And there has been some talk about how to pay for all of this. I 100% agree that we have to be responsible with tax dollars, but we do not priority budget in the province of Alberta. If we go around this room and ask what our priorities are, those should be funded first. The other stuff should come if we can, but we need to do it in an open, transparent way so we all get to see what's going on.
Thank you very much. And on to you, Ms. Smith. How would you go about restoring education funding so that it's in line with inflation and takes into account the increased complexities of our student populations?
I favor a per-student funding approach. I recognize why the government brought in the funding model that it did, and in fact it works. It works for those school systems that have declining enrollment to provide stability. So if you want to look at what happened over the last 2 years, we had funded in 2019 for an enrollment of 730,000 students when they only had 711,000 students. And so those school boards were able to get an additional dollars as a result of that. And then in 2020, same story, we funded for 726,000 students and there were only 716,000 enrolled. Now that doesn't help the growth schools. So I think we should maintain the funding models so that we have stability in the event of declining enrollment to give school boards the opportunity to try to increase enrollment. But I think we need a more flexible model as we've got certain jurisdictions and certain communities that grow. So I want to take a closer look at that. The other most important thing we could do is continue to tackle the federal government and their NDP partners when they're trying to increase our carbon taxes. They voted to increase carbon taxes by 300%. So one of the ways that we dealt with that is we gave a reprieve on the 13 cent a liter carbon fuel tax at the pumps that we did have control over, and that ended up saving the school boards $2 million worth of relief. We also had a fuel price contingency fund that we reinstated in June that also saved school boards $8 million. And we have budgeted an additional $15 million per year for the next 2 years over the budget cycle to deal with not only the instability that we have in taxes caused by the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but also because we have continually increasing carbon taxes that have been imposed on us at the federal level. So we intend to continue to fight that. And we would welcome the NDP to also take the position that we should not be increasing the carbon tax 300%.
Thank you very much, Ms. Smith. And Mr. Belayon, how would you go about restoring education funding so that it is in line with inflation and takes into account the increased complexities of these student populations?
Stop printing money, expand revenue, move away from wasteful spending. The climate change agenda won't cut it either. In fact, carbon pricing must go away altogether. So too does things like the UCP's $1.2 billion taxpayer-funded carbon capture. That's a waste of taxpayer money. We can return to a resource powerhouse. Alberta's oil sands are our key. That potential prosperity, your funding, was undermined internally and externally. We must come together on resolving that. Eagle Spirit Pipeline was a 50-50 private equity partnership. 34 First Nation communities were signed up along its route, plus many more across Canada. Peace River's Carmen Creek project provided the Woodland Cree Nation 85 full-time jobs and 200 seasonal. Their people had a taste of prosperity and hope. Bill C-69 and Bill C-48 paused that project, and I say paused, which will lift many Indigenous peoples and Albertans from poverty into prosperity and provide you with the funding that you need. How do we win back Alberta's right to expand our resources? Our solution is coming together in a movement of the people outside of the legacy parties, working together to restore Alberta's prosperity. Through the Clarity Act, we have a peaceful and democratic path to seeking a strong negotiating lever. The people of Alberta will hold a united conversation of a referendum on independence. That will give us the leverage we need to negotiate with Ottawa to restore Alberta's rights, freedoms, and prosperity. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for answering that third question. On to our fourth question, and with this one we will start with you, Mr. Mangat, and go in reverse alphabetical order. Mr. Mangat, we know based on statistical data that there is a high rate of teacher dropout in the profession within the first 5 years of teaching. How would you support divisions with teacher retention? Mr. Mangat.
You're making me more nervous with the first question. It is true, teachers have a high burnout rate, and we're still friends with our son's elementary school teachers. One of them retired after 30 years. She was so passionate about teaching. But other teachers that I've talked to, yes, 5 to 10 years, there is a burnout rate. And when I have discussion with these teachers, it's because it's a large classroom size. They're burdened with a lot of extra work. They have to attend all these parent-teachers interviews after school. They're doing a lot of work after school, weekends, preparing. So their conversation has to take place, how to simplify their processes, how to simplify their teaching. And there's no clear answer, but I think a conversation needs to happen with the teachers, the principals, to retain teachers. And some of the teachers have come across, 5 to 10 years, they're using it as a stepping stone to other careers, which is fine. A lot of people do that, and before they get burnt out. Mr. Moderator.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mangat. On to you, Ms. Dirk. How would you support divisions with teacher retention? Ms. Dirk.
This is an excellent question, and I feel I can answer this question because I was a teacher in the system for many, many years, and I could see teacher burnout. But one of the things about the teaching profession is people go into this profession because it is a caring profession. And I'm using the word profession on purpose. Teachers are professionals. They are not technicians. And so when they're not treated as if they are professionals and they are treated as if they are technicians there to simply deliver a curriculum, they don't feel appreciated or respected. So forcing a curriculum, teachers to teach a curriculum that is backwards, that is 1950s, that they know in their hearts and their guts is wrong, is damaging for children, that hurts teachers. I am one of those teachers. I remember waking up in the morning with bloodshot eyes because I was marking papers till 2 in the morning. I taught English, and I know how important it is to get those papers back to those students on time because they need the feedback. It's okay, that was all right. Teachers don't mind working hard. Teachers don't even mind taking money out of their pockets to pay for school supplies, which many of them have been doing. But when you don't feel respected and appreciated, that's what causes teacher burnout. So I know the NDP government, my government, me, we would respect teachers. We know they are professionals. We would fund them properly. We would listen to teachers when it comes to writing a curriculum. 99% of teachers, I will stop there.
Thank you very much. You did have 10 seconds left. Mr. Bayon, same question. How would you support divisions with teacher retention?
Frontline, more funding is necessary for teacher supports. My question is there room to streamline educational bureaucracy? I know where there's a potentially available funding, where there's definitely top-heavy bureaucracy. Half of Alberta's budget goes into public health, AHS. It eats up $23 billion, and there's redundancy, waste, and corruption there. For the level of health care Albertans receive, the budgetary spending of AHS does not add up. Where's the money going? Let's talk about what the UCP and the NDP have done. The research of Alberta's own Dr. Mackus is staggering. I'm going to talk about COVID now. First, some truth. Over 80 Canadian doctors have died as a result of COVID-19 vaccinations. Alberta nurses and doctors continue to be silenced. The corruption of AHS, the private corporation of the College of Physicians and Surgeons, and the lawyers who control those organizations must be broken. The college's absolute corruption and hold over the sovereign healthcare rights of Albertans must come to an end. It would take about 2 weeks for the Premier, the ministers, and the UCP MLAs to take action and amend the Health Professions Act to dissolve the College of Physicians and Surgeons and get control back of our healthcare system, and there's so much funding there that's available. Thank you.
Thank you. And to you, Ms. Smith, how would you support divisions with teacher retention?
I think we need to look at the last 2.5 years as being very unusual. And it's the reason why I took a strong position during our leadership race, that we've got to let kids be kids, and we cannot shut down schools again. We have to normalize the learning environment. A lot of the problems that we have came from the open and close. The disruption in our education assistance came because classrooms are closed. The online learning environment didn't work particularly well for a lot of kids. I've heard that the kids that did the best were the ones that spent the most time in the classroom. And I think that is a great credit to the professionalism of teachers. I understand that the burnout happens because of that uncertainty. That's why we need to normalize the environment, make sure that we're having additional education assistance to lend a hand. Plus, when you have such an abnormal learning environment, you can't bring in the volunteers and others who can also be assisting with the learning circles. So I'm recognizing that we are in a very unique period where there's pressures, and we have to make sure that we're answering those pressures. I did campaign on saying that it is true, Conservatives normally talk about how they're going to balance the budget and how they're going to make sure that they pay down debt, but this is one area where we have to make sure that we fund sufficiently so that we can bring kids up to the level that they need to be so that they can thrive. The other thing I would say is that I've also heard that teachers who are particularly under stress as they were trying to teach online while they had their own kids at home. Online learning can work very well as long as you've got the supports for it, but I think my overwhelming response that I've heard from parents is they want their kids to be back in the classroom because there's a great social environment. They want their kids' activities to continue on, and I think that's going to go to address some of the mental health issues. The last thing I would say is that we do have to provide mental health supports, because I'm sure that that is one of the things that's putting additional stress on teachers. So that's another area that we have to make sure we're investing appropriately in.
Thank you. And finally, with you, Mr. Marashida, how would you support divisions with teacher retention?
So I think we've been talking about it a bit. I've been talking about how we need to bring resources so that there's a manageable workload in the classroom for teachers to start with. But I think we have to go a little bit back further, and we do have to start with a conversation about respect and that they're part of the process of teaching, about doing those things. When we talk about curriculum development, for example, it just is beyond me why the government of Alberta would not take into consideration how the teachers feel about a curriculum that they are going to be charged with teaching. It does not make sense. And then further, then we say implement the curriculum, and by the way, you don't get any extra resources to do it with. Hopefully you can get it done. Like, those things are not compatible with a functioning classroom. They just aren't. When it comes to the pension plan, how many teachers wanted the government of Alberta to take their pension plan over? I have not spoken to any. Now, I don't know where we are in that, but again, if you feel respected and a partner in the process, then you are much more likely to want to consider staying in the profession for the long term. That just makes sense. When I ran a small business, and although I only had 3 or 4 employees ever at a time, I held on to my employees for a long time because I think they felt part of the conversations we had. We tried to be flexible with their schedules. We tried to understand the stresses in their life, the things that would make them better in the job, doing the job for me. And I think teachers need to feel exactly the same way. And last but not least, I think we have to go to how we support teachers outside of the classroom, the demands that are made for them outside of their teaching. And again, I think we have to reconcile that with the time that they have. We're asking families to take time with their kids. Teachers need to take time with their families, and we have to reconcile that conversation as well.
Thank you very much, and thank you all. We will have our 5th and final general question. Let's start with you, Mr. Morishita, and go in alphabetical order. Mr. Morishita, 95% of students are served by Alberta's public, separate, and francophone schools. However, much of the conversation around education has been focused on charter, private, and homeschooling. How will you ensure that public schools are prioritized? Mr. Morishita.
So I am a huge supporter of public schools, the public system, the public Catholic system as well, because I think it's barrier-free access to a high-quality education. Alberta leads in a number of areas when it comes to education, and that's a result because the system itself has served us well. It's under a lot of stress right now, but I think in order to keep it going, to make that investment worthwhile, we have to reinvest, and we have to make sure that our priority is public access. So if we have limited amounts of dollars, as has been discussed here tonight, then the priority should be public funding, period. And for privatization and other things that has to be set aside, public education has to be the priority for spending without a doubt.
Thank you. Ms. Smith, how will you ensure that public schools are prioritized?
Well, I have always been very clear that I believe in parent choice in education. And the reasons for that are I think, pretty solid. One is that there are many parents who feel very confident in homeschooling, and that we only provide $850 per student for those parents. And so it allows for more dollars to be targeted towards public school. In fact, we have 93% of the total student enrollment is in public school, but they receive 95% of operational funds. It's because parents in those other alternative models are willing to take on a larger proportion of the cost. In the independent schools, we only fund them at 70% of the per student grant is about $5,300. Charter schools are also public schools because they cannot charge tuition, but they also have to shoulder a greater burden of the operational and capital costs. So we fund our public system and our Catholic system at the highest level. I think that shows the level of commitment. I also think that from what I've heard from parents, they want their kids to be able to go to the local community school because that's where they build the community out with their friends and peers. They have greater access to a whole variety of activities. So I think that public and Catholic education are always going to be the preferred option for parents. The approach I think that we have to take is making sure that we understand how much we are supporting our education system, because the principal ways in which the budget is spent, we've got healthcare, we've got education, and we've got infrastructure. We are spending $8.4 billion in education for the 2022-2023 fiscal year. And while I recognize that there's going to be additional pressure points so that we can address some issues as they emerge, I think there is no question the commitment that our government has towards supporting public education.
Thank you. Mr. Bayon, over to you. How will you ensure public schools are prioritized?
Well, I believe the needs of the students are the #1 priority, and I agree that parental choice is very important regarding that. Our child was a victim of severe bullying and abuse at school. It was very bad. The bureaucracy and the lack of support we received was very troubling. So thankfully, we had the means of removing our child from that public school system and moving over to a private school. But many parents, majority of them I would say, don't have the means of that benefit. So there needs to be choices. And furthermore, many parents today may not agree with the public education curriculum. And there are concerns regarding that. So again, choices are important. Utilizing charter, private, and homeschooling options are the right of the parent. It's the Independence Party's belief that the funding follows the student, giving the parent choice and also leverage in making sure that their child is being educated in the way that they believe. And yeah, and that's where we stand, so thank you.
Thank you. And Ms. Dirk, how will you ensure that public schools are prioritized?
Well, I think the key here is that 95% of students are in public schools. The NDP absolutely supports public schools, whether that is a Francophone school, whether that is a Catholic school, or whether that is a public school. I hate to point out the obvious, but Ms. Smith does not support public schools and funding public education over there, because how do I know that? Well, she actually told us in a 2018 opinion piece, Daniel Smith, maybe we need to defund public schools, where the thesis of the argument is maybe every independent school needs to be fully funded and we need to phase out every government-run, union-controlled public school. Okay, well, I believe that public schools are the great equalizer. Every Alberta student deserves a quality education. Every student is important. It doesn't matter where you come from. So I know our government will respect that by restoring funding to public education, by respecting teachers as the professionals that they are, by restoring PUF funding, by hiring back the valuable educational assistants, by cutting the war room and funding the classroom. The other thing that we would like to do is we would like to put a counselor in every single school, a mental health counselor, to address the problems of mental health. This is something that has been suggested, and this is something that we promise to do.
Thank you. And finally, Mr. Mangat, for you, how will you ensure public schools are prioritized?
Yes, the Wild Rose Independence Party believes that parents should have choice. That's what freedom is, the freedom to choose. Some parents may not believe in putting their children in public schools. They may choose to have homeschooling. They may choose to put their child in charter school. They may choose to put their children in faith-based school. That is their choice. Funding has to follow the child. Public schools are important. Now, not every parent can send their child to a private school or to some charter school, because charter schools still you still have to have some little bit of fees. But the public schools have to return to teaching fundamentals. I've talked to some professors at the university level, and they feel a lot of children coming out of school just aren't equipped to tackle the high level of education. So choice is important, and public schools have to return to ensuring fundamentals are strong. English, math, chemistry, those subjects are far more important now. Mr. Moderator?
Thank you very much. And thank you to all of our candidates for answering our 5 general questions. Candidates, I know how hard it can be to sit there for an hour, so why don't you guys take 10 seconds, stand up and stretch if you need, and then we'll continue on. When we do continue on, we're going to be going on to our 4 stakeholder questions. These are questions that have been created by different stakeholders within the education system. The first question will be asked from our our wellness mentors. There will be 4 questions, as I stated, and each candidate will have 2 minutes as usual, and we will once again begin with Mr. Bayon and then go alphabetically. And can someone please get some more water for our candidates, please? All right. If you're ready, Mr. Bayon, I will let you know when timing is up because Christian has stepped away from his post. Mr. Bayon, wellness mentors, the mental health needs, this is from our wellness mentors. The mental health needs of children and youth in this community have always been great. In the past 4 years, we have lost 5 youth to suicide in Brooks schools alone. School counselors are critical to the success of students struggling with psychological challenges. Would each candidate speak to how their fiscal policy will support the mental health needs of children and youth in our school system? Mr. Bayon.
That is a great question. It's something my wife and I are very passionate about, mental health of our children, of Albertans in general. In discussions with doctors and psychologists, there's a great concern. And what was said to us that we need $1 billion just to start, just to begin. Some way, somehow, we need to find funding for this. It's a crisis. It's an absolute crisis that leads to overtaxed healthcare system, people that, later in life, they can't be independent, they can't support themselves, so it goes on and on and on. So we need to cut to the root of it and try to find, we need to do it. We need to, again, just work together, find funding somewhere, shuffling money around perhaps in AHS, and really focusing on this issue. Because, there's so many people in this province that need that mental health support, so we just need to find a way to get there. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Ms. Dirk, same question for you. Can you speak to how your fiscal policy will support the mental health needs of children and youth in our school systems?
I think mental health crisis is becoming something of more of an issue in today's day and age, especially in the last 2 years with the pandemic and the isolation that students have experienced during the pandemic. And in addition to that, I would believe that a number of students have fallen behind, and that would probably exacerbate some mental health issues. So when you cut funding to education and you don't have the proper supports in place, like the EAs, that can exacerbate the mental health problems. Our government has put out a promise that we want to put a trained counselor in every single school to work with the students. That would be a step in the right direction. Another step in the right direction would, sometimes a teacher, him or herself, can make such a difference in the life of a child. You can make or break a child, but when a classroom is too large and the teacher is overstressed and overworked and feels underappreciated, that teacher doesn't have perhaps the energy or the time to spend with those individual children, and mental health issues might be myths that a caring teacher could pick up. So again, it goes back to...
Sorry, 30 seconds left. We just don't have our timer. So
okay, and again, it goes back to funding. We need to restore funding to education. To underfund education by $1 billion in the last 2 years is inexcusable. So funding back in education, really appreciating teachers.
10 seconds.
Okay, that's it.
Brent, could you step in there? Yeah, thanks. Go ahead, 10 seconds. Nope, okay, sorry. We'll have him do it for now. Sorry about that. And on to you, Mr. Mangat. Can you speak to your fiscal policy and how it will support the mental health needs of children and youth in our school system?
Yes, mental health is becoming a large issue in our society. whether it to be social media, whether the children feel isolated, whether they don't have family support. There's various reasons for mental health issues that we're encountering in our society today. Wasn't prevalent, when I was in public school. For some reason, I guess there was no social media at that time. But I agree with what the others are saying. Somehow we need to find a little bit of extra funding to provide counseling. But in addition, I think as leaders, we also have to stress family support for children. I think that's one of the reasons when kids have mental health. Both parents are working, there's not enough time for them to spend with their children, and then it falls onto the school and their friends. That's another reason, I think, that's another issue that should need to be examined. Funding, yes, but also family support. Mr. Moderator?
Thank you. To you, Mr. Morishita, how will your policy support the mental health needs of children and youth in our school system?
Well, I think we have to take a bit of a community approach. Mental health for students isn't only in the school, it's also in the community as a whole. And I think one of the problems that we have with government systems, they tend to be very monolithic and very linear up and down, and they don't take into account communities' needs and communities' changes. And I think that's where the consolidation has to happen. I think whether it's health and education working together to provide opportunities, to provide supports, to recognize those and make investments properly in a community setting, because there's lots of other leverages besides just the health budget and just the education budget to do this. I'll give you an example. When I was mayor in Brooks in 2017, we had some stresses around some suicides, some youth suicides. In fact, I remember my son-in-law telling me about one in particular, and it became a strategic goal of ours to have the safest community in Brooks to be the safest community to raise children. And we put money where our mouth was. We put $50,000 in a budget. Unfortunately, we weren't able to activate that because the system was so closed to opportunities to partner with the city of Brooks. So those are the kind of things that I think we have to take into account, that there are many resources out there that we need to work together in a community setting with education, with healthcare to provide those services. I think it's doable, but we also have to allow communities to be able to have the actual authority and the ability to implement those kinds of changes. And again, when it comes to specifically in schools, I think it has to be managed at the school level, where you have whether you have classrooms or teachers that need those more often than not. I think, again, it has to be pushed and not managed so far away from the actual classroom and the actual school. I think there's a lot of capacity here to do a better job.
Thank you very much. And finally, Ms. Smith, if you could speak about your fiscal policy and how it will support the mental health needs of children and youth in our school system.
Sure. You've probably seen over the last few weeks, it's become a bit of a parlor game to take something I wrote in the past 27 years of public life out of context to try to create some sort of Twitter storm. So let me just tell you what it gives me a good opportunity, I think, to differentiate my basic perspective on life versus the NDP. I think what we have seen with the NDP is they like to have large, top-heavy government structures where dollars come in at the top, and if it can finally filter its way down through multiple layers of bureaucrats, then it finally gets to the front line. And that's part of the reason we don't have enough resources on the front line. I would like to see how we can change that type of approach, where we fund the front line first so that we can have the teachers and the education assistants and the supports in classroom, and including mental health, so that we can start squeezing out those administrative and management layers that are very expensive, number one, and don't deliver frontline care. And I can tell you the example that I would use. We created a new department for mental health and addiction. It was started off as an associate ministry. It's a $2 billion spending department, but it only has 40 full-time staff. And the reason for that is the philosophy that we apply to how we want to support mental health and addiction. is that we want to use the community groups. So the dollars go to the mental health area, and then they flow through down to local community groups, because it's those local groups that have the interconnections, who can do the peer support, and who can make sure that the issues are being addressed. And I can tell you on the issue of addiction, it's having a massive impact to do it this way. We've seen a 51% decrease year over year in opioid addiction. We've seen a 39% decrease in hospitalizations due to opioid intoxication, and we've also seen a 39% decrease in ambulance services. So putting money on the front line, it works, and it will work in mental health when we're dealing with our young people as well.
Thank you very much. All right, our second question, which we will once again just go alphabetically, starting with Mr. Mayon, is from our administrators. That'd be principals, vice principals, etc. School leaders, particularly principals and vice principals, are professional colleagues, not just managers. Are you willing to commit to keeping school-based administrators as members of the Alberta Teachers Association? Mr. Bayon.
I'm going to, that's something I'm not well versed on. So I don't know the bureaucracy of the educational services enough to make a comment on that, so I'll pass on that one. Thank you.
No worries. Okay, let's go ahead to you, Mr. Mangat. Same question. Are you willing to commit to keeping school... Sorry, I skipped Mr. Dirk, didn't I? Mr. Dirk, are you willing to commit to keeping school-based administrators as members of the Alberta Teachers Association?
That's something I would certainly be in support of. I believe that when you're, well, I don't just believe, I know I worked in the system. And so I know that the principals and the vice principals of the school, they were your colleagues, they were your friends, and they were your supporters. When you take administrators out of the ATA and they become your supervisors, you're creating a division in that particular field that doesn't work as well. I know that because I actually taught in two different systems. I taught in the public school system, and I taught at the college. And when I was teaching in the public school system, the administrators were part of the ATA, and they worked with you. In the college, we had supervisors. And when you have supervisors, there's a tendency sometimes to reach for power, and it does not work as well. I believe in collaboration. I believe in teamwork. I think people work the best when there's mutual respect between administrators and teachers, and therefore I would be very much in support of keeping them as part of the ATA.
Thank you very much. And to you, Mr. Mangat. Are you willing to commit to keeping school-based administrators as members of the Alberta Teachers Association?
So the question is, administrators to be part of the Alberta Teachers Association?
Yes, so school leaders, particularly principals and vice principals, are professional colleagues, not just managers. Are you willing to commit to keeping school-based administrators as members of the Alberta Teachers Association?
Geez, I'm not an expert on that subject, so, and I'll pass that on.
No worries. And to you, Mr. Morishita, the same question.
Sure. Actually, I agree with Gwendolyn here. I think that principals and vice principals should be part of the ATA. I think having lived experience in classrooms and settings and having actually gone through the efforts that the current teachers they're guiding and supervising is important. So yes, I think that should stay exactly the same, the way it is today.
Thank you. And lastly, Ms. Smith, same question. Are you willing to keep school-based administrators as members of the Alberta Teachers Association?
I think so. I think we're asking the question of whether or not principals should be pulled out of the bargaining unit. Is that what you're asking? Is that what the question is?
I can't clarify because I didn't write the question, unfortunately.
Look, I think that we have to identify the issue we're trying to solve. And I think the issue we were trying to solve came up over the last year when we found that there was a teacher who had been abusing children over a long period of time, and it was not addressed through the local hierarchy that was happening in the school. And it may be because principals look at their teachers as colleagues as opposed to as their bosses. And so I think we've addressed that a different way than what is being proposed. We have a new teaching profession discipline commissioner that's going to oversee the teacher discipline process at arm's length from government. It begins its work on January 1st of 2022. I would hope that everyone would be supportive of that, because the only other alternative would be that these issues have to be investigated by a superintendent of a school system. Now that may work when you've got small school systems, but in a school board like the Calgary Board of Education, which is one of the largest in the country, I think it's the second largest in the country, if you've got upwards of 7,000 or 8,000 teachers on staff, it would be impossible to oversee issues of discipline if it's just one superintendent that's going to have to do that. So I think we have to be aware of why it is that we're having this conversation, and it was because we did have situations where children were not being protected and that we were not seeing an appropriate level of discipline. I think we've answered that with the approach that we've taken, and I'll rely on my ministry to see if we need to go any further on that.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. This next question is from the Catholic teachers, and it's a simple yes or no, starting with you, Mr. Bayon. Do you support the existence of publicly funded Catholic schools in Alberta in the form they currently exist? Yes or no?
Yes, I do.
Ms. Dirk? Yes. Mr. Mangat?
Yes.
Mr. Morishita?
Yes.
And Ms. Smith?
Yes, I went to both public and Catholic schools, so I support both the models.
I was hoping for more fight. Come on. All right, this last question from our stakeholders is from Student Council, so I'm imagining these are brought to you from students themselves. How do you plan to support public school educators in addressing content and skill deficits that have emerged due to disruptions to in-person education between 2020 and 2022, particularly with grade 10 to 12 students who will be writing diploma exams? I'm going to read that again because it's an important one. From the Student Council, because of all the disruption that we had, mostly from COVID-19 over 2020 to 2022, particularly with our grade 10 to 12s who are going to be writing diploma exams again for the first time, how do you plan to support and address that? And we'll start with you, Mr. Bayon.
With me?
Yeah.
Yeah, that is a very challenging question. What are we going to do with that? There's a big gap there now, and geez, I think that's an approach from all sides. And I know teachers are extremely busy and tapped out, teaching the current group of children that are coming up. Perhaps online supports, online tutorials. Yeah. Again, that's something that needs a lot of conversation before I can give an adequate answer. There's a lot of stakeholder conversations that will need to be had with that to really address that issue. So, thank you.
Thank you. And over to you, Mr. Same question. With regards to the 10 to 12, grade 10 to 12 students who will be writing their diploma exams, how do you intend to address the content and skill deficits because of the COVID-19 pandemic?
Wow, I hope I use a full 2 minutes here. I love this question. I absolutely do, because I used to mark diploma exams and I used to teach students who had to write their diploma exams and the grade 9 achievement exams. And so I spend many years preparing students to write these exams, so I know a little bit of something about this. I know that teachers who are teaching in those subjects where you're preparing students for diploma exams, you have an extra level of responsibility. And teaching English, I know that you have to work your students very hard, and they have to, I taught writing, and I taught critical thinking, and I taught reading skills, and so it's constant writing and rewriting and writing and rewriting, and so much of teachers' time and energy is spent in marking and giving feedback to students. And so the way that you can catch students up is by funding education properly and reducing those class sizes. Yes, if I have a group of 30 papers that I have to mark in an evening as opposed to 40, it makes it a whole lot easier to give feedback to students, and that feedback is so very important. Giving the students a fresh teacher who feels respected, who feels that they are a professional, that their job is important, that will go so far in helping these students achieve and catch up. And so it's time in the classroom, it's a dedicated teacher, and I am sure that when the supports are in place, we can do this.
Thank you. Mr. Mangat, same question with regards to the pandemic and the impact it had on our learning. Yeah.
Would you mind if I came up there and read the question?
Sure, come on up.
There's an echo.
Certainly.
Yeah, the only answer I can think of is, you know, these students who have had COVID disrupt their classes, how do you get them ready for these tests? I mean, the only I guess, solution I can think of is to get them more support, so at least they can start writing these exams and get ready for them. That just means a little bit more extra funding, and we're all about lowering taxes and be accountable. But this is a very special case that happens once every 100 years. So maybe we'll have to find funding, a little bit of funding from somewhere to get these students ready to write these exams, because that is fairly important for them to pass and move forward to further education. Mr. Moderator?
Thank you very much. Mr. Morishida, with regards to the pandemic and the impact on grade 10 to 12 students, specifically about diploma exams coming up, how do you plan to support and address the content and skill deficits?
Yeah, I think it does come down to extra resources and how it's managed at the school level with the student population that you have. Again, that's going to be different. Some classes are going to be okay, some aren't, but we have to have flexibility to manage and be able to pull those resources in. I don't think there's magic in terms of what the government needs to do. They just need to step up and say, here we are, the resources available, and now we turn it over to you to get those kids to be able to pass those diplomas and get to be moving on. So I think it's simply a matter of an extraordinary circumstance, and it needs extraordinary resources, and the resource the government can provide here is funding.
Thank you. And finally, Ms. Smith, the same question. Grade 10 to 12 students who will be writing diploma exams, how do you intend to address content and skill deficits?
We have to make sure that the kids who want to go on to university are prepared in grade 10, 11, and 12, brought up to grade level. So whether that's education assistants or outside tutors or additional support in the classroom, those kids need to be supported. And I've supported the grade 12 exams because when you get into university, many of the courses that you take do have a 50% final exam. So for kids who are going to be in that kind of environment, I think they need to become aware that that's what they're going to be in for if they go on to university. I think where we need to do more work, though, and it's part of the reason why I created a new ministry of skilled trades and professions, is that we don't have the full broad range of technical skills that kids are getting exposed to. There are many kids who are going to have really rewarding careers that by going directly into the workplace and then pursuing apprenticeships later in life. Right now, our average age for kids entering an apprenticeship program is age 27. So you've got kids who are spending 10 years sort of trying different things out before they identify what they're really meant to do. And I think that is a real tragedy that we don't connect those kids to those opportunities earlier. So one of the things that I've taken a look at, and our government has taken a look at, is what they do in Germany, where they allow for kids to get access to those trades programs a little bit earlier, starting in junior high and high school. We can use the RAP program, we can use Careers Next Generation, and we can make sure that kids have the full range of opportunities. And the kids who are going to go on to rewarding careers in the trades or professions, perhaps they don't need to be taking the year-end final exam. Maybe we can be a bit more flexible in allowing them an alternative pathway so that they can get connected to those workforce opportunities earlier.
Thank you. We are now going to turn to the questions submitted from audience members. For these questions, we're going to give you 1 minute. The first question is going to be for everyone, and then we have 5 questions to individual candidates. So this first question, we'll start again with you, Mr. Bayon. It's all for all candidates. We're going to have 1 minute instead. So green will be 30 seconds, yellow will be 20 seconds left, and 10 seconds with the red. Mr. Bayon, the question is, Brooks is known as the city of 100 hellos. I thought it was 1,000, wasn't it? No? Thanks to its rich cultural diversity. With that, how do you view the importance of anti-racism education in our schools? Mr. Bayon.
I would say Alberta is the province of 1,000 hellos. It's been a blessing for me to travel this province far and wide to all corners and to meet many amazing Albertans. It is honoring one another, our diversity, and it starts at home. And I've been, as a proud Métis and Indigenous, I experienced racism growing up. I've seen Alberta grow up, and I've had conversations with individuals that moved here from other parts of the world, and they said the same thing. We're on the right path. We don't need to stir the pot. Let's just honor who we are. We're a diverse province. We welcome all people. And let's keep that going. Thank you.
Thank you. And to you, Ms. Dirk. Brooks is known as the city of 100 hellos thanks to its rich cultural diversity. With that, how do you view the importance of anti-racism education in our schools?
I think this is a very important issue, and I actually quite liked your answer, Mr. Bayon. I think it comes from just understanding and respecting the diversity that we have, not only in Brooks, but I think we're seeing that in Medicine Hat and throughout the province as well. I know from my work, volunteer work with Samis Immigration, that new Canadians need to feel welcomed and respected in our communities and involved in our communities. And so one of the ways we can do that is by meeting new Canadians and speaking with them and finding out what their interests are and developing relationships with them.
Thank you. Mr. Mangat, same question. How do you view the importance of anti-racism education in the schools?
Well, I was one of the lucky ones. When I immigrated to Canada in 1970, I was the only minority in my school. But I was lucky. I had very good friends. They understood me, I understood them, and I was able to grow with them. But this is a very important question. How do we resolve anti-racism? One of the ways we do it is to teach our children in schools. It's a soul-to-soul connection. No matter how we appear, no matter what color our hair is, no matter who we are, where we come from, it's a soul-to-soul connection.
Thank you. Same question for you, Mr. Morishita. How do you view the importance of anti-racism education in our schools?
I think it has to be taught. I think the history of the past and paying attention to what's happening in current events when it comes to discrimination and racism is important. I think it has to be taught. My family was interned simply because they were from Japan, and my grandmother was born in Canada, identified as a Japanese, and then thrown in a camp, lost her land. And that's because people didn't understand how they were acting. Anti-racism is an important thing to be taught. I think it's going to make our society better. It's going to teach tolerance and understanding and inclusion. So I absolutely support that.
Thank you. And finally to you, Ms. Smith, how do you view the importance of anti-racism education in our school system?
It's very important. I remember interviewing Kalichi Madhu, who is our new deputy premier, and one of the things that he told me was when he first arrived in Canada from Nigeria, he wasn't getting return phone calls when he put his resume out until he changed his name to Casey Madhu. And so one of the things that I think it's important for us to do as a government is make sure that diversity is reflected in all levels. We've got diverse candidates who represent us in office. I hired Aku Afudaiki as a deputy minister so that we can begin to have a more diverse lens in hiring through that department. We're going to develop an immigration program that's made in Alberta, much along the lines of what they have in Quebec, where we can draw in people from around the world directly here. And in addition, I've got a gay chief of staff. We've got a transgender woman who leads our chief firearms office. And these are the kind of things that we need to do to demonstrate that we respect diversity, is that we've got to put it into action. And that, I think, will send a message.
All right, we will go now to the final 5 questions. They are just for the candidate that I name. And once again, we're going to go alphabetically. And so we're going to start with you, Mr. Bayon. You have 1 minute. It's just for you. How would you address the substitute teacher shortage, especially in rural areas? How would you address the substitute teacher shortage, especially in rural areas?
Well, living in rural Alberta, again, it's all tied to funding. Where does that come from, and how do we recruit teachers in rural Alberta when we don't have the supports to keep them there? We got to find some funding some way, somehow. And again, I'll hammer on that all night long. We need to get our revenue going again to support all departments across the board. Thank you.
Thank you. This one is for you, Ms. Dirk, and just for you. You have 1 minute. What would you and your government propose in order to reduce teacher workload and prevent further teacher loss in this province? What would you and your government propose in order to reduce teacher workload and prevent further teacher loss in this province? Ms. Dirk.
Thank you. Well, one of the ways you could reduce teacher workload would be to fund public education properly and reduce class sizes. The other way you could do it would be to hire more teachers, okay? Again, it goes back to class sizes and, restore the EAs in the classroom, because the EAs can help so much. The other way you could do it would be to fix and to build schools and have more space for teachers. And that's all I have to say on this one.
Thank you. All right, Mr. Mangat, and I can bring this over to you if it's still not working, my mic for you. You mentioned infrastructure as an important issue facing education. How does resolving these problems help to create solutions in a classroom? Once again, you mentioned infrastructure as an important issue facing education. How does resolving these problems help to create solutions in a classroom? Mr. Mangat.
It doesn't really help to have a solution in the classroom. My simple point was to bring this up was to, if infrastructure starts crumbling, you end up putting a lot of money into it to correct it instead of having that money towards funding and finding teachers. So I'm trying to avoid spending a huge capital amount immediately on infrastructure. I'm just saying, let's develop a plan over 20 years, it could be 10 years, to address these infrastructure issues save that money and put it towards teachers' use or resources.
Thank you. To you, Mr. Morishita. EAs, which are educational assistants, have been mentioned many times tonight, especially with regard to their importance. Why does their wage not reflect this? Once again, EAs have been mentioned many times tonight, especially with regard to their importance. Why does their wage not reflect this? Mr. Morishita.
I'm guessing because there's just not enough money, and they aren't recognized for their professional work that they're doing, and that needs to happen. There's a number of areas beyond EAs as well as that's happened, but speaking about educational assistants, I mean, if we're going to attract high-quality people to be in classrooms with kids, to advance their knowledge, to advance their ability to succeed in the world, we have to start paying them the proper amount. And again, identifying education as a priority for all of us means that we can spend more money there. It's just we spend to where it's important. There are other things that are less important. Priority budgeting for the Alberta Party and myself is a very important pillar of what we do. We do it all the time with municipalities. We've had to delay things, wait for things, but we always make sure that our core services are always well funded so that we can continue on. So that's what we need to do in education as well, and that means paying EAs properly for the work they provide.
Thank you very much, Mr. Morishita. And our final question this evening is for you, Ms. Smith. You say there needs to be mutual respect between teachers and government. What will you do to ensure this happens? You say there needs to be mutual respect between teachers and government. What will you do to ensure this happens? Ms. Smith.
Well, one of the things that I did do when I decided to enter back into public life is I made sure that I had a meeting with the ATA executives so that we could talk about what the issues were that they wanted to raise and what the pressure points were. I think that the government, we heard loud and clear that we were too aggressive in rolling out the curriculum too quickly in too many grades all at once. And I think Adriana LaGrange found a bit of a saw-off by having the K-3 for language arts and mathematics implemented. I'm actually delighted to see that we have seen that there are a number of school authorities, 55 in fact, that have chosen to implement the grade 4 to 5 math and English as well. And I think that that's a demonstration that we may need to have a more flexible approach so that different school boards can move forward at a pace that makes sense for them. We have a lot more work to do to get buy-in on the curriculum. I've heard that loud and clear, but I think we're making some good strides in trying to find that balance.
Thank you very much, Ms. Smith. And thank you to all of our candidates for answering all of our questions this evening. It is now 8:45, so we will finish off with 2 minutes for final comments from each candidate. We'll start with you, Ms. Smith, and work backwards. So, Ms. Smith, final comments. You have 2 minutes, so Mr. Shell will go back to green for 1:30 for yellow, and 1:50 for red. Got it? All right, Ms. Smith, you have 2 minutes for final comments.
All right. A few months ago when I started my leadership campaign to become premier, I made commitments to teachers, and tonight as your candidate for Brooks Medicine Hat, I just want to reconfirm those commitments to you because they remain unchanged. Unlike many places in the world, Alberta's economy is in strong fiscal shape. In fact, with the change in the royalties now applied to our oil sands companies, we are going to have a long-term increase in the amount of revenues that we receive. That gives us a lot more flexibility, especially as well as we go into a surplus, not only for this year, but also projected for next. But as conservatives, we also believe that we have to be responsible to the next generation. So we will be talking about paying down our debt. We will be talking about investing in our long-term savings. And we will be talking about how we invest in infrastructure and some of these pressure points that we're seeing that have emerged, especially as we face an affordability crisis. But we have to acknowledge that we have to give our kids every opportunity so that they are not left behind. They cannot be left behind. So we have to make the investments now to bridge the gap and the current needs of our educational system while growing the opportunities that are available to our students. So I am actively looking at ways that we can provide more educational supports to our kids so that we can bring them up to speed on the learning loss over the last 2 years. We also have to acknowledge that high class sizes and the complexity of classrooms, if we are not supporting them with education assistance, we are doing a disservice to our teachers who are clearly suffering from burnout over the last 2.5 years. You see that as teachers exit the system. This has to be resolved. And finally, we also, as I mentioned, have to restore the respect between government and teachers as equal partners in making sure that we provide the very best education for our kids. And I look forward to working with you on that.
Thank you, Ms. Smith. Mr. Morishita, you may have 2 minutes.
Well, thank you very much for attending, and thanks very much for the thoughtful questions. When I look out in this crowd today, I see kids that were with my kids. Some of them dated them. One of them actually married one of them. And brought me grandchildren, thank you very much. But luckily, there are no teachers here that taught me. Because they would be telling stories in the hallway, unfortunately. But I will tell you this, that school for me was a place, I don't remember a lot about my biology. I loved English and social studies, but what I remember is that when I left school, I was equipped and socialized and had self-worth, because that's what the teachers did for me in those 11 years I was in school. And I have a 6-year-old. My granddaughter's starting grade 1. And there is no more important investment that Alberta can make than in its population and in its education. There is no bigger investment we can make. It's the most important thing we can do. And it's going to serve us for future generations for a long time. I want my daughter to stay in Alberta. I'm born and raised in Alberta. My kids are born and raised and live in Alberta. I want my grandchildren to have that opportunity. My wife, yes, you were born and raised in Alberta too. But we need to make that investment. And to have that investment, we need infrastructure, and the biggest infrastructure we need are teachers. We need enough of them. We need them to love their jobs, to want to go to work every day, to stay for 30 years, and to make sure they are providing the educational experience and opportunities that our children need. I love this place, born and raised here. I've lived here my whole life. Nothing is more important than the education system for me right in Brooks Medicine Hat. It's served my family well. It needs to continue to serve my family well, and you will always have my 100% support.
Thank you. Mr. Bagnett, you have 2 minutes.
Yes, public education and education in general is very important. You look around the world in developing nations, they thirst for getting a good education and moving forward. I do agree with the UCP that trade schools are very important. With children, not everybody is equipped to go to university. I've been involved in 2 campaigns. I always have talked at the doors. University degree does not mean success. I've worked as a commercial property manager with many trades. They are great thinkers on their feet, great leaders, and I believe in high school we should be unfolding this opportunity to students, saying, you know what, you may not be academically inclined, but here's another route, try it. I've told my kids, try becoming an auto mechanic, try becoming a carpenter, find your passion. You might fail 100 times, but one day you will discover that and be successful. We need to have our kids have these routes available to them. As a member of the Wild Rose Independence Party as well, we believe in parents' choice. We believe, homeschooling, charter schools, private schools, and public education, because choice will provide competition, competition will provide efficiency. Mr. Moderator.
Thank you very much. Ms. Dirk, 2 minutes.
Thank you very much. It's been an honor and a privilege to be here tonight. I spent 33 years in the classroom teaching students, working with educators, and so this is an issue that is extremely close to my heart. I do believe that there really are two versions in the room tonight. Strong support for public education is what you are going to get if you elect an NDP candidate in this riding. The truth is that we are going to be having a general election in May. And, you know, the writing on the wall is suggesting that Ms. Notley and the NDP are going to form government. And so if you don't want some of the chaos and the broken promises of the UCP government, I think I'm the one that could have a seat at the table and I could fight for public education. It is truly close to my heart. We promise to put funding back into education. We will lower class sizes. We will build those schools. We will restore PUF funding. And we will bring a curriculum to you that is worthy of our children, a curriculum that will teach critical thinking skills, creative thinking skills, innovative thinking skills, and most important, critical literacy, because there is so much misinformation on the internet nowadays that if our kids don't know how to discern fact from fiction, we are going to be living in a very scary world. So if you want real change in education, I think you need to elect Gwendolyn Dirk. I am the candidate for Brooks Medicine Hat with the NDP.
Thank you. And finally, Mr. Bayon, you have 2 minutes.
Thank you. It's been an absolute blessing traveling across Alberta working on this grassroots movement of the Independence Party of Alberta. I asked myself the question in coming to Medicine Hat, what is the role of an elected representative? In my opinion, their role is identifying the issues, needs, values, and wishes of a community, and then prioritizing those without prejudice or favoritism. There's also the duty of conversation, as we're doing tonight, of listening and understanding. When elected representatives dictate how Albertans are to live our lives, raise our children, and run our businesses, those who value freedom and prosperity have something to say about that. What is the role of elected representatives? To walk as softly as possible, as to not disturb the balance of communities, families, and of the individual. Alberta is blessed with selfless, caring, and principled people. Albertans deserve to have that elected representatives who pay that forward also. The role of an elected representative is to immerse themselves in community, to listen, to understand, and to be there when their people need them to be. So I say this, let's never again mask our children, let's never again shut down our schools, and let's have a conversation, please, about shutting down the COVID-19 vaccination program. My friend, Dr. Paul Alexander, would love to meet with the UCP government, with the Premier, my friend, Dr. Peter McCullough, my friend, Dr. Robert Malone, the inventor of the mRNA tech, would love to have the opportunity to do so, to finish the conversation that was started on November 10th, 2021. I advocate for the rights, freedoms, dignity, and prosperity of all Albertans. I dedicate my life to that. It's been a pleasure being here tonight.
Thank you, Mr.
Thanks
Bayon.
so much.
Ladies and gentlemen, round of applause for our candidates, Mr. Bayon, Ms. Dirk, Mr. Magat, Mr. Morishita, and Ms. Smith. Thank you again to all of our local ATAs, Grassland, Chrysler Redeemer, and Francophone. Thank you again to our candidates. Thank you to Griffin Park. And finally, thank you to all of you for attending both in person and online. Tomorrow night, if you're interested and you want to hear more from our candidates, the Chamber of Commerce is holding a public political forum at the Heritage Hotel from 7 p.m. to 9 p.m. And I think they have a good moderator that night too. Thank you very much, everyone.